Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast with your host, Laura Hehman.
Hello, Clark Massey.
Hello, Laura. All right, we have, in the history of our podcast, already done 2 podcasts on inflation. We do these podcasts about every year and a half, and we're going to recap those 2 old ones that were in the midst of all the brouhahas of inflation. And we're going to talk about like where we're at right now, because we're going to talk about kind of Econ 101 concepts so that you can reason from first principles about what's going on right now and what the future is going to hold. In the first inflation podcast, the year was 2021. We'd seen the money supply, as published by the Fed, go up by 1/3 in 1 year, which is, historically, there is no corollary for that, and we were experiencing what the Fed called 0% interest rates. And we, as, people who were getting mortgages and taking loans, saw as 3% interest rates. By the time the 0% gets all the way up to you, it's 3%, and that was a very weird moment. And that's why we did an inflation podcast, because when the money supply expands by 1/3 or even any at all, you should expect inflation. In fact, very significant inflation, like kind of for most of our listeners, once in a lifetime inflation for that moment of their life. And the interest rates were subsidized, like literally artificially low. And they were artificially low because what the Fed was doing to drive them low. And we'll talk about how the Fed relates to the interest rate, because it's not that they set it. That's a common misunderstanding. We're going to get there. But at that moment, you could literally borrow money at 3%, and the projected inflation rate was above 3%. That should be impossible. Whenever that happens, everyone should borrow as much money as they can, buy any asset whatsoever, because it will go up faster than the interest on the loan you took. And that was kind of the advice of that podcast. And at least a couple listeners listened to that advice and did okay. All right. This is a get rich quick scheme. No kidding. But but it was real it was real advice that, you needed to take seriously. Episode 2 was probably a year and a half after that. And it was about how the national debt had crossed a point where it seemed like it could forever grow faster than the economy, even if we did nothing, and that is a snowball point where it was going to run away. Right. And one way to quantify it was that the EU forces their members to go on austerity measures. And when they hit a certain red line of debt to GDP, and we had doubled the EU red line. I was just trying to get it out there that, hey guys, even though no one's talking like this is alarming, this is very alarming. That we've doubled the EU red line and not even started talking about paying down the debt. The other issue there was the government had grown to be about 40% of the total economy without growing the tax revenue to pay for that 40% of spending they were doing in the economy. And the other part was that, today I just did this math that just shows the same situation it was a year and a half ago, where it's if you take everyone who files taxes, everyone who could potentially be paying taxes, but this also includes welfare families who file taxes just to get a refund. Because you can even, by the way, there's welfare that passes through tax refunds. So if you pay nothing in, you can still file taxes and get money. At least historically you could. Sometimes there's this kind of welfare fraud where families will say their kids are dependents of another family, and then that family will pay them money for that.
Yeah, but you're not talking specifically about fraud, or are you?
Well, I'm just saying that when you look at the total number of tax filers, they're not all paying.
Yeah.
There are people actually receiving more than they pay in that number.
I mean, a lot of people, not just welfare recipients, but yeah.
I think most people are getting, if most people who get refunds are still on net paying in.
Oh, right.
So so the total number of filers, including trusts and people who are not paying in at all, if you take our national debt and divide it by the total number of people who just file taxes, the number per person is $200,000 per person. All right. That's wild. Okay. But But like, why is it wild? Because aren't these all just insanely big numbers? Who cares? So that's what we're going to try to get to today, is kind of like from first principles saying, what is the consequences of this and what does it really mean? In that podcast, I said, look, this is what causes hyperinflation, or maybe not hyperinflation, maybe galloping inflation. So hyperinflation would be like 100% rise in prices in 1 year or a couple months. Galloping inflation would be like 15% inflation a year. And a lot of, quote, first world countries have done this. Italy's done it. Like a lot of countries have been through these tragedies, and they are tragedies because people go hungry when this happens. Regime change happens when this happens. When I say regime change, I don't mean Biden to Trump. I mean like U.S. Constitution to new Constitution, So,
we did the 2 inflation podcasts. We did a family budgeting podcast. We've talked about financial stuff in other podcasts. And I think the idea is that, I know I do. A lot of us lack kind of the basic econ background to make sense of what is going on. So you're going to try to provide that. And I think the aim is for it to be helpful kind of for family decision making, but also just helpful for understanding what the problem is and kind of, or just what the future may hold, and how to think about it. Because I do think that I think when things are like kind of black boxes, they're like doubly stressful.
It may seem dumb, but I'm going to start with the question, what is money? Because you kind of need to kind of get a hold on that to know what is inflation. And then we're going to do what is inflation to what is the interest rate. Okay. And how these things actually are working in our economy right now. So money in Econ 101 is just supposed to be something that can easily be transferred. It needs to be durable. It needs to be standardized. It has to have a certain amount of scarcity. And it doesn't hurt if it has some intrinsic use. Like gold has been money for a long time. It does also have a real use, but it's not, the real use isn't quite why it's so valuable, And what money is then is an intermediary good to get us off bartering, right? Like if you have something you want to barter and you need something else, it's quite a lot of work to find a person who needs what you have and you need what they have and make that deal. Money makes all that so much better because it's like, all right, I trade this to anyone who wants my thing for the intermediate good. And then I find anyone who has what I want and give them an intermediate good and take that. Right. So it just makes all trade far more efficient. Right. Many things have been money throughout history. There's been like shells, there's been food used as money, there's been rocks used as money, etc. But all the ancient civilizations seem to have kind of gotten down to precious metals at the end of the day. Because precious metals are very transferable, they're durable, they're standardized, they're somewhat scarce, even though you can get new deposits of them occasionally. They are still scarce enough to work. They're very easy to transport. Like if you had a backpack full of gold right now, you could easily have $2 million in that backpack and you could carry it, right? $2 million worth of food is not fitting in a backpack. It's just a much harder thing to deal with, And that's what money was historically, right? And there were different little games we played to mess with money. Like you might know that like the coins have the edges little serrated so they could tell someone was shaving off the edge of the coin to make it lighter and steal a little bit of the gold off of it, Have you heard that before, Laura?
No, I had no idea.
Yeah, so there's all these like things that were done throughout history.
And the penny is not serrated, which is interesting.
Yeah, they don't care about the because people used to shave the edges of coins, for a little bit of precious metal. So there's there's ways to like weigh coin. There's ways to verify the gold content, by testing volume and weight and things like this with just water and scales. And you can just do things to like validate these precious metal coins, right? But after a while, what we found was precious metal was kind of a drag. And I think it might have been the Knights of Templar who invented modern banking, and they invented it for pilgrimages. After the Crusades, people wanted to travel from England to Jerusalem. And if you carry all your gold, all it takes is one robbery and you're kind of up a creek somewhere between Israel and Jerusalem, between Jerusalem and England. So what they used to do was the Knights of Templar would have a monastery in your town, and they'd have a monastery in Jerusalem, and they had a way of you bringing gold to the monastery in your town and then having you be able to pick it up in Jerusalem, right? So it was like a deposit transfer type thing. So you didn't have to,
note, like a bank note.
Right. Some type of receipt was issued, and that was how the first banking was kind of coming about like that, right? I'm sure there was forms of banking before then. Maybe this is the first international banking. So eventually we got to the point where instead of carrying all your gold, we had paper depository slips for gold, and that's how we kind of came into paper money. And eventually we decided we didn't even need our paper money backed by gold. We could just have paper money. Sometimes that's called fiat currency. By the way, I've noticed that a lot of people have gotten kind of smart about this due to cryptocurrency because they're all interested in the roots of money. But even without cryptocurrency, this should be very important knowledge for all of us. What ends up happening, though, is like you say, well, the US dollar, what is it? Is it worth anything? There's no gold behind it. What is it? Is it worthless? And I'll say, I actually think it's worth something. Not just because we all agree, but because even if you try to live your life without US dollars and you try to use Bitcoin or gold or whatever all year round, guess what? You're going to pay taxes at the end of the year and you're going to need some US dollars. The use of the US dollar is to pay your taxes. And it's an extremely useful commodity to pay your taxes. Mm-hmm. So I do think it does have a use at some level, but you could argue with that. It doesn't really matter. The point is, though, it's no longer backed by gold. That's what money is. What inflation is this money is an intermediate good used to transfer, say you're selling your harvest and you're trying to buy a vehicle, right? In between is money, right? If you increase the amount of money, the supply of money, but you don't increase the amount of the harvest and the amount of the vehicle, then the denomination of these things changes to where the vehicle is far more expensive because there's just more money chasing fewer goods. This is what we call inflation. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. When we have countries running their own currencies, there's this constant temptation for them to cause inflation. So normally what a country should do is it should say, we're going to spend, the U.S. tax revenue is about $4 trillion. So I'm going to use that as a base number. We're going to spend $4 trillion, in roads and whatever, national defense, whatever, $4 trillion. If that equals your tax revenue, then everything makes sense. You take in $4 trillion, you spend $4 trillion. But what the U.S. actually does is it's been spending $6.5 trillion while taking in $4 trillion. And the question is, where do you get the $2.5 trillion you didn't take in? Well, one way is you could just, quote, print it, just increase the money supply, and then everyone's going to pay for it through inflation. Mm-hmm. So you're going to pay for it one way or the other. You're going to pay for it by the tax revenue, or you're going to pay for it by inflation. Or the U.S. government could do what's kind of a more honest transaction, and it's kind of doing two things at once here. But the more honest way to do it would be to borrow the money the way you would if you were a family. You can't print money, so if you want to spend more than you make, you borrow, right? So the U.S. government could borrow the $2.5 trillion every year and spend that instead of printing the money. They could just borrow it, but then they're going to keep building this national debt. Okay. The truth is that we're doing both. We're kind of both borrowing it and printing it at the same time. And one of the major mechanisms for this is the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve, it's 100 years old, and it's supposed to control a couple things about the money supply. It's supposed to control how much debt we're issuing so that we're not issuing always exactly the amount Congress needs to fund their budget. But it's also controlling banks because the Federal Reserve's coming about after an enormous bank collapse. And I skipped one thing. So money supply is how much money is in existence, but economists also discovered that money supply is how fast we pass it around, right? And they call that the velocity of money. Mm-hmm. If you look up, and what's important here is the concept, not the formula. There's going to be a formula for the velocity of money, but I think it's a very poor measure. But the velocity of money would be someone sells you a good, say we all have say there's $10 in the economy, but we're all like spending it all every day, that's a very high velocity. Or say you take your $10, put it in the bank, and the bank immediately loans it to another guy. Now that it's as if two people are using the money at once. It's in your bank account and it's also loaned out, right? So the more it gets loaned out through this kind of chain reaction, it's like a high velocity.
Is that good or bad or neutral?
It's neither. It just is a factor, right?
Okay.
But it also creates a danger.
Like a higher velocity creates a danger, you're saying? Or
Well, I'll explain the danger, because
Okay.
the danger is arguably what caused the Great Depression.
okay.
What happens is if I've when I was in Econ 101, they used to say it's as if every dollar's in 7 people's pockets, because of the loan thing, right? Well, the higher the reserve rate of the bank, like there's so much misinformation about this. Like somebody was telling me that like fractional reserve lending is the root of all evil, is shouldn't be allowed in banking. And I'm like, fractional reserve lending is banking. Like it's just not banking. Like fractional reserve meaning like if you take in a deposit of $100, you reserve a fraction of it, like $10, and you lend out 90. If you're reserving all of it,
Then you're just
you're not banking.
a building with money inside.
You're a security deposit box,
Right.
And we'll be charging you to put your money in it, not the other way. We won't be paying you interest, So the thing is the fractional reserve is important. Like if someone's holding back 20% of every deposit, then the velocity of money is less than if they're holding back 10% of every deposit. So the Federal Reserve was doing a couple things. They were setting the fractional reserve rate, the required reserve rate of banks. They were dealing with the bond market, and they had this thing called the discount rate, which was the rate at which they would loan to banks who needed money. And what's interesting about that is in the Great Depression, there was a cascading banking collapse. So as these banks failed, they all called their loans, right? But no one could pay the loans because there's literally not that many dollars in the economy. So it becomes this cascade. So the velocity of money went to like zero. It just like,
Yeah.
so no one had to print, no one printed too much money. And in fact, instead of it being inflationary, it was what they called deflationary. It actually destroyed money because all the cascading bank collapse was if money was being destroyed in the process. That's kind of theoretical, but it's like this idea of like, if we cancel all the loans, it's less people have money than if the loans are out there.
So inflation, the value of money decreases.
Right.
Okay. And explain this. This is different.
Deflation would be the opposite. If you think about it, like say there was a fixed amount of money. This is what the Bitcoin guys want. Mm-hmm. If there was a fixed amount of money, you would expect prices usually to decrease. As we get new efficiencies, as we pay off capital investments, you'd expect competition to drive prices lower and lower. So if you made like $100K today, 10 years from now, you'd be able to buy more with your $100K you're making than today. Like that would be kind of normal if there was a fixed supply of money.
Okay.
In reality, we've for most of our lives had 2% inflation a year. Lately we've had 3%, and we had that year of like over 10%, depending on which measure you look at. All the measures are a little bit biased. That's been kind of the weird roller coaster we've been on, right? So we're not used to ever seeing prices just step downward over time as you would if there was a fixed money supply. Okay. Deflation is a very destructive thing when it happens through like bank collapse. And it's arguably what caused the Great Depression. So as they're trying to reorganize out of the Great Depression, they create new rules for banks. And one of the rules is...
I'm sorry. I'm going to...
Yeah.
So in inflation, the value of your money decreases. In deflation, you just lose your money. What?
The value of a dollar is higher in deflation, but you'll just have less dollars around.
Okay. Yep. Okay.
You got me? Like if half the gold, like if we were all on gold coins, and half, or like say we were on Bitcoin and a computer virus wiped out half of it or something, we'd be in a problem. Like each Bitcoin would be worth more because there's only half as many as there were before, but it would also be very painful,
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, and if they're more valuable, people are using them on less.
Well, there's just less people who even have a dollar.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's the issue. So at the end of that, we realized that we can never let banks have a cascading failure again. This came up really big in 2009. Yeah, 2008, 2009, right? But like the way we started to protect that was not to really protect the banks. We did it by the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, that's going to insure all your cash up to $250K and all your deposits. We also did that by the Federal Reserve creating a mandatory minimum reserve rate. So like a bank can reserve 50% of their deposits if they want, but they were usually mandated to reserve at least 7% of their deposits, right? And this had something to do with setting the velocity of money, but it also had something to do with just like securing that there will not be future cascading bank collapse.
Okay. And 7% was enough to do that.
I'm surprised, but here's the real horror story. In 2020, they removed the requirement. Their now required reserve rate is 0, and it's been 0 since 2020. I know. We're running a new experiment here, okay?
Okay, and this is not info that's news. Attracted to in the news. Okay, so did I miss this or did everyone miss this?
It was in the news. I heard about it just over the news. Maybe I pay attention to these things because I know what a reserve rate is, you know? Mm-hmm. But like I then just verified it before this podcast that it has remained at 0. Oh. So banks are no longer required to reserve money.
Okay.
Now, so what happens, so say a bank loans out all the money and has no deposits, and then you come and ask for your money, they can literally go to the Federal Reserve and ask to borrow money to cover their deposit.
Okay.
All right. And that's called the discount rate, the rate at which they borrow money to cover their deposits. So that's what is the game they're playing right now, assuming I really don't know. I mean, this is a required reserve rate, not a actual reserve rate. The actual reserve rate of banks
they might set their own reserve rate at something else.
They should. Yeah. So I don't know if they are or aren't, but I know that the regulation part of it is now 0, which didn't work during the Great Depression, I'll say. So anyway, we learned we needed one regulated, and now we don't. The problem with a lot of economics is that we give people all the benefit of the risk and don't give them any of the downside. So like, for example, say a bank does something really irresponsible, but has they're like gambling, you know, and maybe they could like win big and everyone at the bank gets rich. But if they lose, they all just lose their job. You know, they don't actually have to pay back everyone who they lost the money of. You know, so they get all the upside, but none of the downside. So this means that corporations typically take irresponsible risks with the environment, with your money, with all of that, because they get the upside, but they actually don't have to repair the environment if they go out of business, you know? So we should be suspicious. Maybe, and that's the end of the podcast. The reserve rate of banks is 0. Be alarmed. You know, no, that was not the point of the podcast, but that is a big piece of information. All right.
When the idea you're saying though is important, it's like if somebody has the ability to take the risk without feeling the consequences of the failed risk that can lead to
they will take more risk than society wants them to take.
Yeah.
That's
right. So that's an interesting principle. Yeah.
Right.
Just by itself.
It's the whole principle of limited liability corporations. Mm-hmm. They have limited liability, limited downside, but they get all the upside. And I would argue, theoretically at least, that we should get rid of limited liability corporations.
Oof.
You know? That like if you destroy the environment, if Coca-Cola destroys the environment in the quest for making a lot of money, not only should we take all Coca-Cola's money, which is the current policy, we should go after the investors.
I mean, I think that's...
I just outed myself as a weirdo, so I'm now worried that no one's going to listen to my Econ 101 wisdom here.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't know. I think it's like... What about small like LLCs? Because it's I know like like a home inspector will
right.
Because if person sues him rightfully or wrongfully, he doesn't want to have his family at risk.
Well, those guys could be bonded. They could be insured for liability. They could do all that. I think like an example I'm thinking of is like I know of a small company that does metal plating. Well, metal plating deals with an incredible amount of toxic chemicals. So you could literally like metal plate your whole life and be illegally dumping chemicals on your property. And then at the end of your life, you just close the business and say, sorry, we're not cleaning up that mess, but we got all of the benefit from making the mess, So that's what we need to like. To me, that's like the just case for regulation. That's the just case for, it's unjust that someone could do that, like get all the personal benefit, paying it out to themselves so it can no longer be tapped, and then declare bankruptcy. And that happens. This is not an unusual, rare problem. This is a problem of capitalism in general. And I'm pro-capitalist, but this is a problem, Okay, so let's talk about money again. All right. So the two things that are part of the money supply is how fast you pass it around, the velocity, and just how much you have printed, right? Velocity is kind of maxed out. We destroyed the reserve rate down to 0. I don't see velocity being an issue right now. How much you print is kind of an issue, right? And that's the bigger issue, probably always. Velocity is just kind of an interesting concept to know about in this. It's also the thing when people start talking about deflation, there's a lot of misunderstandings of that. It's almost always happening because the velocity of money is collapsing through a bank collapse. Just know that. Okay. Now, what's the Fed doing? So the U.S. government spends more than it took in taxes. And so what the U.S. government does is this is what a treasury bill is, also known as a T-bill, also known as a bond. Okay. So the U.S. government will go out, and we, by the way, paid off the national debt in basically the late 90s. Like it was almost down to nothing. And now it's like $200K a person. So this has all been a problem this is an Obama, Bush, Trump, Biden problem,
Right. This is like why Bill Clinton is remembered as a good president. Right. I mean, that was under him, right?
It was under him. He got, he also was in a blessed period of time where the Cold War ended. We could cut military. The internet was invented. And he had a very strong Republican Congress, even though he was a Democrat. But yeah, no, he deserves some credit too. All right. When we issue this bond, what happens is, say we overspent by, it seems like on average, $2 trillion. So we're going to go to the bond market and say we're issuing $2 trillion worth of bonds. Some will be 10-year loans, some will be 5-year, some will be 1 year, some will be 30-year loans. And we go to the market and we say, who wants to loan us $2 trillion? And we do it by an auction, okay? And the price in the auction is the interest rate. So somebody says, I will loan you $1 trillion for 10 years, or let's make it more reasonable, $1 billion for 10 years at a 10% interest rate. And somebody else says, no, I'll do it for 9. Somebody goes, no, I'll do it for 8. I'll do it for 5. And whatever number they naturally come to in that competitive auction is the interest rate on that T-bill.
So it's not people sitting around calculating and deciding what the interest rate is going to be.
Right. It's done through auction, right?
Okay.
Even if the auction is not a formal auction, it's basically that's what's happening.
Okay.
Economic substance of it is it's an auction. All right. Now, what the Fed does to, quote, manipulate the interest rate is they can come in and say, no, you'll do it for 5, I'll do it for 4. But like, where's the Fed getting their money, right? So what the Fed does is they'll come in and offer to buy down the interest rate. So once it's 4, it's not like Fed.
I just got lost. Okay, who's borrowing the money? The government.
The government. So who's lending the money? Private investors, banks, foreign governments.
But so here the Fed and the government are not the same.
They're not the same.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So the government's going to borrow money. They have an auction to see what interest rate they're going to borrow the money at. One of the participants in the auction is the Fed. Okay. Now, once the interest rate has been set, that's the interest rate that clears, say, if we're trying to finance $1 billion and it clears at 4%, that means that it's not that one person bought it all at 4%. It's that anyone who had an order in would get some, but it would all be set at 4%.
Okay.
Right. So the Fed didn't have to buy all the debt in order to get the rate down to 4%. They just had to be the one buying enough that it pressured the price down to 4%.
So when people talk about the Fed deciding to lower the interest rate or not deciding to lower the interest rate, it's kind of, did they decide to make that bid or not?
Exactly. It's called the open market policy of the Fed. This is how they're doing the interest rate setting.
I had no idea. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So for a while there, the interest rate to the federal government was 0. Which meant every auction, the Fed was coming in and bidding so aggressively, it could get the interest rate down to 0, which just meant people were...
So then does anybody want to lend money? Anybody
Apparently, yes. Apparently, yes.
Okay.
Okay. And this was a subsidy, And so that interest rate was artificially low, but it also meant that all the people who refused to loan to the federal government were now free to loan to you for your home. And, a lot of money was out there because it was basically creating money.
Can you explain why it was a subsidy?
Well, because it's kind of like the Fed doesn't actually have to have the money to buy the bond. They take on the bond, and it's basically, in essence, creating money because it's letting the government spend money that it didn't have to take out of the economy. Instead of taking it out of the economy, instead of Chrysler giving them, or Ford Motor Company buying the bond and giving them some of Ford's money to use, it's instead going to the Fed, and then the Fed it's instead not coming out of Ford Motor Company. It's coming out of this like quasi-governmental agency, the Fed.
But the Fed doesn't have the money.
Yeah, so it's more like the Treasury Department handing it to the Fed, probably. It's more or less what's happening, right? So the government gets to spend money without taking money out of the economy is the take-home fact, which is the same as printing money. This is why no one seems to understand this. It's because we call it printing money, and it is. It's as if printing money, but in reality, it's the Fed bought the bond, and it let the government spend the money.
How does the Fed decide if it can or can't?
Well, if you just read the news, I'm not sure this is the real reason, but they say it's because they're managing inflation rates, right? Or they're trying to stimulate the economy. And so they wanted to bid it down to 0 because if we bid it down to 0 and print all this money, then everyone can have lower interest rates because that interest rate kind of ends up affecting all the other interest rates. Like if we're not borrowing Ford Motor Company's money for the federal government, then that money is available to be borrowed by you for your home mortgage, or like all that money is now available for other lenders, right, and borrowers. So what ends up happening is this interest rate becomes very low, artificially low, because the Fed is interfering in the bond market and letting the government not have to actually borrow money to pay money, to spend money, right? And that artificially low interest rate is available to whom?
Like home buyers and, oh, no.
It's not available to the poor, I'll tell you that.
Oh, wait,
it's available to you because you may be qualified for a home loan or for a car loan, but who it's really available to is like the Jeff Bezoses of the world and stuff like this, who can take out, or hedge funds. I think that's the best example. Hedge funds can start taking out really low interest rate loans because the Fed has subsidized the interest rate. And this is why we saw Wall Street buy up homes, because they could buy homes at a lower rate than what they projected inflation to be. And it is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Because like when I have done real estate investing, and when I look at myself versus Wall Street, I think, well, I can actually visit the home. They don't visit the home. I know local guys who can fix a home. I can go over there and fix a home myself and fix leaky faucets and save money. I can go mow the lawn myself. I can know everything. I have every advantage over Wall Street. The one advantage Wall Street has
Volume.
is 0% loans.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I can actually meet a tenant, get a better tenant, but like the advantage they have is cost of capital, which is low interest rate. And that's why Wall Street was doing things that are not even economically make any sense. Like Wall Street's not good at managing residential property, but if it's so cheap, they might as well.
Yeah.
Local people are much better managing residential property than Wall Street, but if the interest rate's too high, they won't, So that's kind of the cost of that money supply problem. And that kind of gets us all the way through our last episode in a sense, because that's what was happening. And the thing is that this way the Fed's doing this is it kind of surprised a lot of economic watchers for a decade that the Fed was able to keep the interest rate so low without causing inflation. Like, for some reason, people kept wanting to loan the U.S. government money. People were okay with it, even though the Fed was bidding down the interest rate to like an insanely low number. A lot of that money was coming out of China. Mm-hmm. You know, but then it kind of ran out, right? Like, what the world I've painted and tried to explain is a world in which the Fed does not set the interest rate. The Fed is a bidder that influences the interest rate. And when the Fed is powerful, meaning like the debt's not that big and they have a lot of capacity, they can really set the interest rate. But as the debt starts running away from the Fed, like when I checked the Fed balance sheet, it's been a couple months, their balance sheet of owned government debt was $4 trillion. The federal debt is $36 trillion. As the ratio they can reliably own goes down and down and down, like, as that 4 trillion, as the amount, like, let's say, I think the highest the Fed ever owned was like 5 trillion or 6 trillion during like 2020. But like, if you can't, if the most they can kind of abuse the most they can manipulate is say up to 8 or 9, the more this debt runs away from them, the less they're influencing it year by year. So the less power the Fed has to set interest rates every year.
Sorry, the Fed's debt is separate from the national debt.
Right. So the Fed owns, the way they're in these auctions is they have to end up buying some T-bills, right? Mm-hmm. So like the amount of T-bills they own is the amount of debt, national debt they own. So I've kind of tried to say, what is money? We got paper money. The government can create it if they want to. They, instead of just creating it in some simple way, like literally running a printing machine, they create it by like playing with the debt market. Right. So if the government's going to overspend what it takes in tax revenue, it's still going to be paid for by U.S. citizens. It's just going to be paid for through inflation, not through taxes. And once again, who benefits and who's hurt by that? People who own massive amounts of assets benefit from inflation.
Right, because their assets become more valuable.
People who rent, people who earn wages, people who don't have those assets are cruelly hurt by inflation. So inflation, if it were a tax, which it kind of is a tax on the poor. Okay. And that's what we saw. You know, we saw 10% inflation. You know, people who saw their 401ks go up 10% didn't care that their grocery bill went up 10%. Right. The poor who don't have 401ks were the ones who suffered. That's kind of the basics of this problem. Okay. Now, the thing that I think that that's all the basic tools that someone needs to understand inflation. So when you hear that inflation's caused by greedy corporations, by ports shutting down, like they said that during COVID, that the reason why the prices are rising is because the LA dock workers aren't bringing in the ships or something, you know, or because factories are shut in China. Well, that's all fine. But as soon as the factories reopen, as soon as the port reopens, as soon as next year's crop failures in the history books and we have a plentiful crop, those prices should go back to where they were, and they don't, because it actually wasn't caused by any of those things. It was caused by the money supply.
So I've seen like the price of beef go up and down, for instance, and that has a lot of factors, right? But so I know that there are some food items that will go down, but after inflation, do prices adjust down ever, or is it like once people will pay $4 for a pound of butter?
Well, particularly commodity prices go up and down, not just up. But inflation is a permanent increase in prices. That's okay. You could define it some other way, but that's the best definition that most people use, is a permanent increase.
Okay. So can you define commodity then? Like
I will, but let me just say, dock workers striking don't create permanent price increases. They create temporary price increases. Okay. Right? Prices can go up and down without inflation, but inflation is a permanent price increase. All right? Okay. And that's caused only by the supply of money, not by a short-term shortage of anything, and not by corporate greed. I mean, if corporations could have been greedy, they would have been greedy 5, 10, 20 years ago. They're always being greedy. It's not causing your inflation. So it's a way that politicians and people are sometimes I think they're good. So, sometimes I think they're being honest. Like they actually think that's why. But that's just a way to distract you from thinking that the government spending over the government revenue is the problem. Okay. Now, you asked about commodities. So, by the way, here's an aside. I've heard this called the Papillon effect back in my old econ days.
Like the butterfly in French?
Yeah, French butterfly. Yep. So, inflation doesn't enter the economy uniformly. It's not like we had 10% inflation, therefore all prices increased exactly 10%. It seems to enter the economy in different like areas and move its way through, right? So like when we have a subsidized interest rate and it's cheaper for people to borrow money, I would expect more inflation in housing prices, because that's a major place we borrow money, is for your house or mortgage, right? So maybe the inflation enters in the housing market and then works its way through the whole economy because now land prices are more expensive. And if land prices are more expensive, then crops will be more expensive. Then, all the way down. Now the wood you build the house is more expensive. Now all the way down, it's more expensive, right? But commodities are the things in our life that have the most fluctuating prices. For example, like if you go to the dollar store, everything at the dollar store now is like $1.25, not $1. Like you go to those walls and they have like all the like movie candies, like Milk Duds, Junior Mints, and Good and Plenty, and all that stuff, right? It used to all be like $1. It's not I can't find it for $1 anymore. It's like $1.25 is you've really scored. You're at Dollar Tree if you find $1.25. So those prices are kind of sticky. Like they're trying not to increase those prices because you kind of look stupid calling yourself the Dollar Tree when everything's $3. But the things where prices are the most fluid is like milk, butter, beef, pork. These are
there's like environmental factors or disease or other things could affect those prices year to year, right?
And there are things, and there's also things that just become more popular. Like I remember
bacon
that
or whatever,
like steak used to be very cheap in America. Like in the 80s and 90s, you could eat steak as a middle-class family, like a lot, like every week,
Yeah.
But like as the Atkins diet became more popular and people were looking for more and more protein,
in the 80s, you weren't supposed to eat steak. It was akin to
it's unhealthy,
cigarettes.
Right?
Yeah.
So it was cheap, but it was unhealthy, So, as like people's dietary habits changed and as demand for the land changed and things like this, steak is one of the more land consuming things we eat, and the price kept, and I remember when mad cow disease hit, the price of steak went sky high, but like, so steak has been steadily rising in price beyond inflation. It's rising in price beyond inflation because our consumption habits have changed, but that's always going to be true. That's just supply and demand. That's what price is, right? Inflation is when all the prices across the board are raising, not when beef is raising. So, but my point with commodities is it's nothing to notice that like 1 week beef is a nickel higher and 1 week beef is a nickel less, because those prices are very fluid. They're commodity prices. They're not like other
right.
things
No.
are
Yeah.
not
I think
fluid.
that's clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
When Honda sets the MSRP for their vehicles for the year, they don't move them up nickels and down nickels throughout the whole year the way beef does, So the Fed, by the way, is up there with the Vatican as something people like to conspire about. And I don't know that the conspiracies aren't true. It's just that like just understanding what everyone believes the Fed does is quite a understanding right there. What we've just explained is kind of what is money, what is our current money, what is inflation, what is the interest rate, and this really complicated way the U.S. has designed to influence the supply of money and the interest rate. That's what that is, okay? This does not change the basic reality of our last inflation episode, which is the debt is now growing by itself faster than the economy, and which means faster than our ability to make progress on it, right? Which means the day is coming where
you're saying by itself, as in we're no longer doing anything to cause it to rise. It just is snowballing.
Just by the interest rate, it's snowballing down the hill and growing faster than we can make progress on it. So like If this was a family, I'd be like, declare bankruptcy now. You're not going to get out of this. Why toil for the start over now? And so that's what the U.S. government's going to be faced with. And last episode, we talked about, well, what are the ways out of this? Well, the economy could grow out of it. Like we'd have to increase our growth, which would mean increasing our growth to the highest you've ever seen in your lifetime for many years in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Or we could cut, which seems unlikely, right? Or we could cut spending to the point that we're making progress on it. But you and I had never seen government cut spending even 1% our whole lifetime. Maybe Bill did it. I'm not sure. I'd have to study that. So there just wasn't like a way forward that this was not going to end in disaster. And that still should be the assumption. And that's a powerful assumption for every family out there.
Yeah.
Like you need to know that sometime the due date comes when we're going to liquidate this, right? And when we liquidate it, inflation's going to be out of control. And as I hope you know now, if inflation's out of control, if you have an inflation crisis, you have an interest rate crisis. Okay? So like 7% mortgage rates are like the 100-year average mortgage rate. I would lock that in for 30 years right now in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. Because if it goes down for some reason, which I don't think it will, you can always change it downward. But you don't want to. But if inflation hits 15%, that interest rate will be above 15%. So that's kind of the biggest take home.
For someone my age, it's like the interest rate being at 7% is crazy because our whole adult lives, it's been a lot lower.
I think it was basically from 2009 to 2021. It was a lot lower. So for a decade, it was a lot lower.
Right. So, and I'm saying like when people my age were like starting to think about buying houses or cars or whatever, Yeah.
So what you want to do is you do not want to be a renter and a wage earner when hyperinflation hits. You want to be an asset owner, and a lot of us are still going to be wage earners. There's almost no way around that, but you could own your shelter.
I bet there's a lot of people listening, though, that hear you say that. And it's like, could I? I don't know. It's not an easy path forward for a lot of people.
I think a lot of people, if they made a hardcore 3-year plan, they could try to work it out. I think a lot of people look at their current way of life and think I could never own a house. But it's like, well, if you take what I'm saying seriously enough, you would change your current way of life to try to figure it out. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying everyone needs to. There are definitely people who probably should not be owning houses. But I do think that this is a real risk.
Well, it's like you got to have a plan going into it.
And if you don't own a house, own something else that will help you in the same way track with inflation. We're not in uncharted territory. Many nations have been through this. Germany's been through this. Italy's been through this. Argentina's been through this. Greece has been through this. Like many nations have been in our situation right now, and it's always super bad and ugly. It's not, it's the type of thing that causes regime change. It's the type of thing that causes violence in the streets. It's the type of thing that causes real hunger. And this is also what the tech bros in the Trump administration think they're trying to address. And by their math, they believe that if they can cut government spending by about 17 to 20% or $1 trillion in the next year, they hope, and also couple that with good growth, they think they might be able to stop the snowball.
You said that's about 1/6 of government spending?
Yeah, I think if we're spending over $6 trillion, but bringing in $4 trillion, and they're trying to cut $1 trillion off of it in 1 year. All right. And hope that would be like an idea of going forward. $1 trillion would be less, $1 trillion every year and cause growth. And they're hoping that will prevent, they're calling it a virtuous cycle. Like if somehow we can get low enough that the debt, what they're really trying to measure is debt next to GDP. Mm-hmm. It'd be really good if we just didn't have debt, frankly. But they're just trying to get the debt growing less than the GDP grows. So that's why they're trying to cut $1 trillion. It's not just because they hate, USAID and DEI, although they may hate USAID. Like whatever they cut, they're going to start with what they hate. But like, if you don't want them to cut that, you have to come to this. I mean, a responsible politician would be like, okay, we're going to cut $1 trillion. Let's argue about what, And I don't even know that their math's right. Like, It's a very speculative mathematical problem to say 1 trillion is the right number. But that's the belief right now.
Your take, well, it's like, government, like this is going to be painful. We do need to cut government spending because it will be painful, but it's like painful now or much more painful later. That's your... I don't want to corner you into an opinion.
It's kind of, no, you're right. In our last episode, I said the debt crisis is coming. Don't know when, next 10 years, sometime it's going to come. When it comes, it'll be the worst time you've ever lived in America.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know how bad, but it'll be bad. All right. And we're kind of like the family who's been eating out on credit cards, and you're kind of having a great time until the day you're not.
Yeah.
And that, like, you're not feeling any pain because you're still eating out on your credit cards until the day you're not,
Yeah.
And this, I think when we had that last episode, I said this is inevitable. It's now at escape velocity. The debt is, right? It's not like no amount of responsible government can get us back, right? And I thought the best you could hope for was to freeze government spending, not actually cut it, because I'd never seen it really cut. So now we're actually seeing them actually make a real effort to cut. And it still seems like it's only like 3 weeks in. So it's still, I think they have to average $4 billion a day or something like that, cutting to like make it, So like they might, like they're doing better than I thought possible at this. It's still you as a person and you as a parent or you as someone who has people to take care of. You need to think that this debt crisis is on the horizon and prepare accordingly.
Well, I mean, and I don't know, because I mean, the debt crisis is here in D.C. because a lot of our friends are government employees or do, government contracts. And so I don't know if we feel it in a different way from you.
You should, yeah.
I think, we are feeling it, so yeah.
Yeah. I think... ever since the Industrial Revolution, economics has been very unstable. Like everyone who was breeding horses up until the car was invented, only a small fraction of those people survive, right? Everyone who was, getting whale oil was driven out of business. Whole Northeast towns are gone because of that. The American garment industry went under, So like, there's always been this like very painful, destructive element in our progress, and right now it's centered on government, and I don't even know if it's going to work, but I know that if you don't do it, if it doesn't work, we're still going to pay the piper. It's just going to look way more dramatic, I'm sorry. This is to me, it's just such a, I'm sorry. It's just happened so many times in history that inflation crisis has happened. And we're just like teed up for it. And so I'm not trying to be a downer. I'm just saying like anyone who denies we're teed up for it is lying on accident or on purpose. I'm not sure. But there's a lot of lying happening about it,
Yeah.
Can I say a weird prediction I made a year ago and you knew it was weird, so you made note of it? I said this about a year ago. I said, I think if you buy a new car right now, you will sell your new car in like 6-7 years for the same price you paid for the new car.
Which it's like, I feel like it's like a guaranteed adage has always been like, your car loses value the second you drive it out of the parking lot. And you're saying that's going to flip.
Which, by the way, that's not true. That adage has not been true for years. If you take the price of a new car and the price of a car that's 20 years old or basically used up, like 20 years old or 200,000 miles, right? It's still worth about $4,000 at that point. And you drew a straight line between those 2 points, and you go to the used car market and figure out where it is on this scale. Like how much if it's 50% used up, it'd be 10 years old, 100,000 miles. It will literally be on that straight line. So old adage
it's not boom and then
right. That line should be a curve if the old adage is true. It should be that when you drive off, like buying a car 2 years old.
There's a sudden drop off.
Yeah. Buying a car 2 years old should save you a lot of money, relatively, for the use life of the car. If the old adage is true, it hasn't been true for a long time.
Oh, really?
I do this math every couple of years because I can't. I kind of blows my mind that people are spending $30,000 for a used minivan with 70K miles. You know, and it's like because the new one's like 50, but it's like, anyway, it fits on the straight line, so it's not really true. But the point I'm saying is that I think that inflation over the next 10 years, unless this cost-cutting thing works, and it might. But if it didn't work, what would happen if we were still on our old path would be inflation would be more than the depreciation of your car. So as you're using your car up and losing value, the prices of cars would be going up so fast. It would be kind of losing value because every dollar is worth less, but like it'd just be funny, you know? So
yeah, that's weird.
I welcome anyone to challenge this on real basic economic reasoning because I think it's just kind of it's what Econ 101 would teach anyone, but you know, the call-in line for feedback and questions is 913-390-3672. All right, let's talk about tariffs for a second. People are going to blame inflation on tariffs like they blame dock workers and everything else. Tariffs can... I do think tariffs might be able to cause inflation. I don't think they will here. But the first question I would have is, what do you think is the purpose of a tariff? Laura Hehman.
I don't know. My guess would be to promote business at home.
Right. To like rebuild business at home, right? That's called a protectionary tariff. Okay. I think there's actually three purposes. He's stated that his purpose is Trump has stated that he wants tariffs in order to actually bring in money for the government to raise funds. He advertises that as a way to cut income tax. In reality, I don't think when you look at the total amount we import, even if you tariffed it nearly 100% and it didn't change, you're really not replacing income tax.
Okay.
But or maybe
that's just trying to make a selling point there.
Yeah, probably. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm adding income tax plus capital gains together, and maybe he's purposefully excluding capital gains and just thinking income. But anyway, he says it's a way to make money for the government. The other thing he says, or the other thing that I think is unstated is what you said, which is build back an industrial base that we lost, you know. And then the third reason would be to twist other nations' arms. You know, and I think it's got to be that because it's already been that. Like he basically threatened Mexico with a 25% tariff going into effect in 30 days. Mexico said they'd send troops to the border and stop fentanyl or do work to stop fentanyl coming in. And all of a sudden Trump's like, okay, I'll delay the tariff. So clearly he's using it he also did it to the Colombian government recently. So he's using tariffs as foreign policy tools, not just as like economic tools. So I don't know. I don't think when one of the great observations about America is that we kind of have everything we need. Like we actually can completely subsist on our own natural resources, more or less. There's not a lot we don't have here. We also kind of make most of the important things that are like shelter, food, transportation. We make most of those things already. So it's not... The stuff that we import is usually our really low-end junk and also our really high-end stuff, you know? So like if you have to pay more for Ferraris and Sereno hams and you have to pay more for dollar store items, it's not clear that that's going to be terrible for us.
You just butchered the name of Serrano ham beyond recognition. So
sorry.
I'm just saying that was the word he was saying.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm teasing, but I think that
I used to be a unilateral free trader, by the way.
Okay.
I used to be totally against tariffs. Even if they're tariffing you, don't tariff back. If they want to sell it to you for cheap, buy it for cheap. It's good for you, you know. Just like and I was all for that. I think what we've seen though is that we don't have an industrial base anymore. And as our industrial base disappeared, not only is that kind of a national security problem, our welfare rolls dramatically expanded. So like the dollars you were saving at Walmart on cheaper stuff were just being paid out in welfare payments, you know? And so I think, I tried to make this point many podcasts ago when Mary was on, and I did a terrible job at making this point, but I said, they're going to treat the government like a business. Mm-hmm. And what I meant by that was, we always think of in terms of political theory, and I've been a big person who does this. It's like, oh, here's some economic theory. How do we make it into law? And then the economy will thrive, And that's not totally stupid. But another perspective is to not think that way, to think of it as like, how do I help America flourish through targeted policies, And like if you're in a small country like a Costa Rica or something, you think, can I make a deal with Ford to put a plant here? And if I can, huge win. It's not really a policy decision. It's like literally a trade deal, like you're a business, And I think the Trump administration is not into theory. It's into like treating the U.S. like it's a business.
It's interesting because I think it's like the many Trump voters were worried about inflation prices at the grocery store, but then we're going to make imported goods more expensive through tariffs. Seems like a contradiction, and I'm curious to see how it's going to work out. But yeah.
My take is where we're at in history is very similar to 1989. And when you see the Berlin Wall fall in 1989, it's like, great, this is awesome. Let all these people be free. And the Warsaw Pact collapses, right? You were also never closer to nuclear war than that moment, Like there was like a lot of ways that could have gone really bad. We were just at a moment of great change, and the right attitude was probably fear more than rejoicing. And I think we're kind of like there, like it's like anybody who says, if someone's just being joyous and not worried, I would be really worried. I would think they're not really based in reality right now.
I really don't want to get into politics too much, but I think that even if you are 100% Trump through and through, it's like deportations are hard and ugly, and losing your federal job is painful, and you have a family. And like, I think it's like a lot of this sucks. And I wouldn't say I've seen a great deal of woohoo, but I want to see less of it. Just because it's I don't know. It's painful, and maybe it's not painful for you yet, or I don't know, but yeah.
Can we just tie it into Catholic social doctrine? Mm-hmm. The Catholic Church is not an economic expert. It's also not a political expert. It's an expert on man and an expert on God. I mean, to the extent anyone can be an expert on those things, they're both quite mysterious. But compared to everyone else, it is, I think, But like, I find that like a lot of the most relevant things that have happened to us that are social justice issues right now, like I think that subsidized interest rate that let all those hedge funds buy those houses was an enormous social justice issue. And I don't think that our social doctrine knows how to handle that. I think the inflation that can happen by massive government debt is an enormous social justice issue. And I just think like all that stuff's big social justice stuff. And our social doctrine's so like not working right now. It's also like, it does so much of like, hey, immigration, here's the good, here's the bad, you need to have a reasonable policy. But it's like, have a reasonable policy, and you just told us the pros and the cons. It's not clear like how helpful that is. It's like, here's the valid issues. It says that, and it's like, okay, good, those are valid issues. I mean, unless you're a really mean person, those are your issues. I don't know that you're adding a lot of value to the debate, Also, the Enlightenment, I've been hung up on this too. Like, should the Catholic Church like bless freedom of speech? Like these Enlightenment like kind of values and discoveries seem kind of important social justice issues.
Yeah.
And I don't see the church like dealing with them directly. So to me, it's kind of like, do we just want to like be quiet about social justice because we're actually not like being that useful right now?
Well, it's interesting because it's like I was like free speech is important, right? But the heart of Catholicism is that you can be silenced in a concentration camp and, enjoy blessedness with God and and get consolation from God and
Well, in a way, I would say the heart of Catholicism is that if you speak up and you end up getting killed, that's a blessed state. Like the martyrs who refuse to renounce, and people who died for proclaiming
I guess
the gospel.
I'm trying to say that it's like that the joy of the gospel goes beyond our rights being guaranteed or not guaranteed, being maintained or not maintained. And it's like we could have everything that is helps a man flourish, which we should go for, we could have all of that stripped away from us and we still.
I think it's kind of like we're a religion that works for the monarch and works for the slave and works for the cowboy out on the range, and we need to be that, right? It did, like, I think the logic of like, hey, the Christ's love also extends to society, not just to individuals, and therefore the church should have something to say about society policies,
Well, I mean, it's like Jesus relieved suffering, and told us to do that, and we want to do that, and we also want to like build the kingdom of God and let people flourish as much as possible. And like, I don't know, I feel like, but I do think if you focus too much on the like circumstance, you can lose the
right, the personalism and the actual. I think God is Loved by Pope Benedict is the best church document that has to do with charity and stuff. But like, here's something that's happening now, like in real life, that I think the church has made a mistake on, right? Like Catholic Charities is by diocese, meaning like the Catholic Charities in DC and Baltimore.
Like the bishop is in charge of Catholic Charities.
Although they don't really do a good job of being in charge of it, right? I mean, literally, like they'll say that, And what's also true is that these Catholic charities have become big government contractors, and they're really not doing, as Pope Benedict would say, like that which is essentially Catholic in the charitable work, because they're contracting, and you can't when you're contracting. And now a new scandal's arising that there's actually another entity called Catholic Charities USA, which is not bound to a diocese. It's kind of the nationwide Catholic Charities. And they essentially were doing immigration work funded by the federal government, where they were kind of training people to perjure and game the system. Like essentially the cartels and Catholic Charities USA were on the same page, where it's like, hey guys,
my gosh. Yeah,
I know, but let's just say this is coming out, by the way. So there are people who are really hating Catholic Charities right now because of this. This is a scar on the church right now, is that like the cartels and Catholic Charities would be like, hey, it might be better if you lose your ID at the border so we don't actually have any proof of who you are. And then when you come in here, I will explain to you that being an economic refugee is not a good reason to get through our immigration system. But if you claim you're politically persecuted, even if you're not, or if you claim, it used to be that if you claimed, it might still be under Biden, if you claim that your husband beats you at home, that's a reason why we can let you in the country and we'll give you a full hearing to discern if you're a political refugee 6 years from now, right? So essentially, these people working for these NGOs literally will say, we're saying this. I mean, I'm not speculating what their motivations were. It's what they told me. They basically thought more immigrants, the better. If they're illegal and it's fine. If they're gaming the system and not here if they're economic migrants, not political refugees, we could still classify them as political refugees. That would be good and be un-Catholic not to. Well, that's the same thing as saying you're kind of subverting a system, subverting the government, lying, perjuring. It's all that, right? And you're taking government money to subvert the government's own system. And it's kind of like, this is not right. I mean, like, why are we in this business as a church? Why aren't we just like feeding the homeless or like helping, with childcare or building up education in America? Why are we doing this? When it just seems like this is not consistent with the 10 Commandments, and it is now putting like egg on our face. It's now making us look like we are a dishonest player in politics. Sorry if no one heard that scandal.
Right. Okay, but two issues. I don't remember why even we're talking about this, but just to summarize it, Catholic Charities not being that Catholic. Pope Benedict criticized that. Pope Francis has criticized that in his latest encyclical, which we covered. He criticized that, and then also.
Pope Benedict put it well. He said that you should not be doing something a secular philanthropist could do. Like your charitable work should be beyond what a secular philanthropist would do.
And I think Pope Francis said, he said something about, overly focusing on the sort of material and structural change. You deny people like the very sort of meat of the gospel, like the transformative, beautiful thing. I don't remember how he put it, but I remember he used the word deny.
I think the missionaries of charity are not doing something a secular philanthropist would do.
And they get criticized a lot.
And they get flack for it, But I'd much rather have that flack than be accused of subverting, the law, while taking government money. Like, what the heck? Let's give back the government money and just do real personal charitable work.
Yeah, I don't know. Encouraging people to lie is definitely a problem coming from the church. So, yeah.
I think with the I don't actually mind the government money either, because at some level it warps your priorities is the problem. But like Mother Teresa has that famous quote that if a prostitute was giving me her money to help the poor, I would take it, So if the government gave me money to go help the poor, I would take it. But you have to somehow have tons of safeguards if you're going to do that. Like, man, if you're not a pure of heart organization, you're kind of screwed by that. Yeah. Well, all right. I hope that just real basic, there's so much weird ideas about, I used to say inflation's like God. Everyone feels entitled to have an opinion, regardless of how much they actually thought or worked on it, But, yeah, so hopefully that was a little bit helpful. Please feel free to call our call-in line. Our call-in line is 913-390-3672 or email asimplehouse@gmail.com. And what do you got to sign us off, Laura?
I have a little fact. Do you know where the longest continuously operating airport is?
I bet it's in Ohio, Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Paris, France.
Wrong.
What is it?
It's in College Park. It's the College Park Airport that flies all these little airplanes. And the Wright brothers started. It was like the first airport where they made like an official airport,
That's
where
cool.
they would have runways and stuff, and it's stayed open, after 9/11 for the president, if the president needed to fly into somewhere, because like a lot of things closed. So it was the first airport and the longest continuously running airport since 1909.
I'm surprised about the 9/11 thing, because I thought he flies in and out of Andrews Air Force Base down there in Maryland.
I think so I'm not they may have also kept that open. It was just that they shut down other airports, and the College Park Airport did not close down as a security measure, as a another place he could fly into. But cool. Also everyone knows where Andrews is, but
right, no one knows College Park Airport. It does seem like you should have at least two, so you could make people guess where you're arriving.
I think we went there the other day, and they said this was the first airport, and I was like, what? No. And then I guess I never really thought about it. Of course, there was the first airport in the last century when flight started. But anyway.
Laura and I were in D.C. when 9/11 happened. We didn't really know each other when 9/11 happened, I don't think. And they shut down Reagan for a year. Reagan's where that bad crash happened a couple weeks ago with the helicopter and the flight. But also, I was working one block away from the White House, and when I was in Boston when it happened. I actually stayed at the hotel the terrorists were staying at before they hit the World Trade Center. But we had to figure out how to get back to D.C., and we rented cars, got back to D.C., and when we went to work one block away from the White House, there were sandbag turrets on the street corners of Washington, D.C. with machine guns. Because no one really knew if an army was invading. It was such a strange... Maybe the New World Order has to start... Maybe instead of dating back to 1989 as the last major inflection point, maybe that's it. So...
Yeah.
All right. Peace be with you.
See you later.
Bye.